As our bulletin cover indicates, we're in this 40-day season of Lent. And over the past couple of Sundays, we've looked at some of the 40-day seasons that we see in Scripture to see what we might learn from them about how we spend this season of Lent in 2023. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the experience of Noah and Noah's fellow inhabitants of the ark to remember that before those 40 days on the ark, it was the sin of people that broke God's heart, and we saw that this might be a season of confession. Last week, we looked at Moses going up to the mountaintop to spend 40 days with God, receiving God's will and God's law. And we imagined that we might use these 40 days to step into God's presence more intentionally. Today, we learn from the experience of Elijah, as we just shared with the children a moment ago. And this story comes from 1 Kings chapter 19. We'll read verses 1 through 10, which are printed in your worship bulletin if you'd like to follow along. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." And then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." And then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly, an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and he ate and drank, and then he went on the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." That's the story for the day. But there's a story before the story. About 3 chapters earlier, we begin this narrative. Today's story began with just telling us about Ahab and Jezebel, but we don't know much about them unless we go back. And in 1 Kings chapter 16, listen to what the writer of 1 Kings has to say about Ahab. "In the 38th year of King Asa of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. He reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Listen to this part. Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him." That's a pretty incredible statement to say that this is the king who has done more evil than all the kings who preceded him. My grandmother used to say about Richard Nixon, "Poor old Tricky Dick. He didn't do anything worse than the rest of them. He just got caught." And we can imagine how in every administration there are probably those intrigues that we don't know about. We can imagine how there are probably those untruths that are told, those things that are done surreptitiously. But look, this writer of the book of Kings tells us not only is Ahab worse than the ones who preceded him, but he's done evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. So we get the idea from the start that Ahab is not up to any good. But it's about to get even worse. In the next verses, the writer of 1 Kings says this, "And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he took as his wife Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshiped him." Can you imagine the king of this holy people of Israel marrying someone who worships another god? And it's pretty bad, because not only does she worship another god, it is clear that she is all in on this worship of Baal. Her father's name is Ethbaal. It has that name of the other god right there in his name. He names her Jezebel. The name of that other god is right there in her name. But it's about to get even worse, because not only does King Ahab take as his queen someone who's devoted to another god, not only does he worship that other god, but he does something that's going to violate those first two of those 10 commandments. Remember, the first commandment is that we should have no other god before or besides the God of Israel. And the second one is not to make any kind of graven image that we would bow down to or worship. The next thing that Ahab does is to build an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. So right there in the capital city of Israel, which is supposed to be the nation that is holy to God, this king builds a temple to another god and builds an altar to another god and worships another god. So we know that there's about to be a big conflict, because this queen Jezebel has that name, Baal, in her name. But here comes this prophet, Elijah, who appears on the scene pretty suddenly as we begin chapter 17. We're just told that Elijah the Tishbite comes onto the scene. And where Jezebel's name has the name of that other god Baal, Elijah has a really interesting name too. In the Old Testament Hebrew, there are two primary names that are used to indicate God, our God, the God of Israel. The first of those is El, sometimes Elohim, which means God. So look at Elijah's name. It begins with El. The second is the proper name Yahweh, not spoken. Every time we see that name appear in the Old Testament, they replace it with the word Lord, capital L, small capital O-R-D. But Yahweh begins with that syllable Yah. And if we were saying Elijah's name in Hebrew, we'd probably say Eli-Yah. El is the beginning of his name, God. Yah is the end of his name, Yahweh. It's almost as if Elijah's walking around with a name that says, God is Yahweh, Yahweh is God. So we have him versus her, Jezebel. And we learn that during King Ahab and Queen Jezebel's reign, there are 450 priests or prophets of that god Baal. And not only that, there are 400 other priests or prophets of another god named Asherah. So these 850 priests or prophets of foreign gods are out there working during the time that King Ahab and Queen Jezebel reign. Well, Elijah gets himself into trouble in chapter 18, immediately preceding the one we've read together today, because he invites those 450 priests of Baal up to the top of a mountain, where he invites them to build an altar, put a sacrificial bull on it, and to call down fire from their god Baal. And they are at it for hours. They limp, they pray, they sing, they cut themselves, and nothing ever happens. Elijah does what we would call in the 21st century some trash talking. He teases those priests of Baal and says, maybe Baal's asleep. Maybe he's just not listening at the moment. But then Elijah builds a similar altar, covers it with the same kind of sacrificial bull, and has 12 big containers of water poured over it so that there's water in a puddle on the ground. And when Elijah invites God, Elohim, Yahweh, to consume his sacrifice, a fire from heaven not only consumes the sacrifice, but evaporates all the water that has puddled up on the ground. And so all the people who are watching from Israel know that God, Yahweh is God, just like Elijah's name says. And in their excitement, in this reminder that they are serving the one who is God, Elijah calls upon the people to gather those priests of Baal, 450 of them, to take them down the mountain into a canyon and to kill them all. It's a grisly scene, 450 killed. And that leads to the passage we read together today that's in your bulletin. Ahab tells Jezebel what Elijah has done. And the queen says to Elijah, May the gods, and notice she says plural with a small g, may the gods do to me unless I do to you what you've done to them. So she's basically saying to Elijah, by this time tomorrow, I'm going to make sure you are dragged down into a canyon and somebody kills you. No wonder he runs off into the wilderness. Can you imagine the queen, the one who has such influence over the king, the one who could probably influence armies and chariots, is sending this message to Elijah, I'm coming after you and you're going to be dead. And so he runs off under that broom tree that you saw represented here a moment ago. And I think what drives him there is a sense of fear. He's concerned that he might lose his life, but I think it's also a sense of fatigue. After all he's done, he feels like he's still in jeopardy, he's still in danger. He might wonder, is there ever going to be enough that I could do in the name of God to rid the people of Israel of this nuisance, this danger of Ahab and Jezebel? And in his fear and in his fatigue, he's ready to quit. It's enough, he says. Take my life, I'm ready to die. It will never be good enough. I will never be able to accomplish enough. I quit. And it's in that context that God sends the messenger. When we read that word angel in the Old Testament or the New Testament, it could literally be translated as messenger. So we don't have to imagine here one with a halo, one with wings, one in flowing white robes. It's simply someone who delivers a message in such a way that Elijah could understand it. And so it may be that when you and I find ourselves in circumstances like Elijah's, when we're waiting to hear that voice that speaks to us, or we're waiting to see that dramatic sort of message, it may be that it's someone very much like you or me who's able to deliver that message to us in a way that we can understand. And the message that Elijah receives is simply get up, come to meet God, and have your faith restored. In our living this 40-day season of Lent, sometimes it becomes for us a going through the motions kind of season. Sometimes it becomes for us a season in which we want to emphasize all that we do. And we might feel as if it all depends on us. If we're feeling distant from God in the moment, we might feel like there's a failure on our part and that we really have to work hard during this season of Lent to be able to draw closer to God. But the message to Elijah is simply to get up and to put one foot in front of the other. And that may be the only message that Elijah is able to receive, given the fear and the fatigue in which he lives. Have you ever had that kind of sense of fear, that sense of despair that leads to loneliness? That maybe you're not up to the challenge that you're facing right now? The sense of isolation? I think that's what Elijah is experiencing here, so much so that he overstates the case to God, that all the people of Israel are after him. In fact, he's just led the people of Israel in uprising against all the priests of Baal. It's not that they're all after him. It's just that one, the queen, the powerful one, is after him. And that leads him to think that things are so much worse than they really are. Have you been in those circumstances? So often, when circumstances change in our lives and we find ourselves in a way of living that's not familiar to us, our first reaction can be one of fear. And because it's unfamiliar to us, we can believe that no one has experienced what we're experiencing, that no one can help, that we're all alone in the world. And I think this is a fairly common experience when we're experiencing grief. When we lose someone who has been such a significant part of our lives, we're not sure how to continue without that person. It can happen in times like retirement, or in times of losing a job or transitioning in a job. When the routines that have felt so familiar to us are no longer there, it can feel as if we are absolutely disoriented. It can happen in other times of change in our lives. When people who are dear to us move away or have different circumstances so that we are not able to have the same kind of interaction with them that we've been accustomed to having, it can feel like we're all alone in the world. And when we find ourselves at odds with people with whom we've always had a good relationship, it can feel as if we have been abandoned. And that might happen because of interpersonal conflict, but in this society today, it can also happen because of which side or another of a political or theological divide we might find ourselves. But maybe we've all known that experience of feeling like we're all alone and feeling disarmed and feeling like we're somehow not as strong as we used to be, and we just want to sit down and cry or sit down and die. And I believe we all know that sense of fatigue too. It's really unfair to talk about on a Sunday morning after a time change, isn't it? Maybe you're feeling right now the loss of that hour of sleep, especially on a Sunday morning when you wake up and it's gray and cloudy and rainy. You'd be surprised at how many people are yawning right now when I bring this to your attention. So we know fatigue in that way, but I think what we're talking about here with Elijah is that soul fatigue, that spirit fatigue, that kind of sense that maybe we're just going through the motions in our lives of faith. That sense that maybe we've grown distant from God. And I believe that's one of the things that Elijah's feeling here. He goes off into the wilderness. For 40 days he's going to walk, and that sounds awfully familiar to us because the people in the Exodus have traveled 40 years through that same wilderness. Remember those times in the book of Exodus and in the book of Numbers in which those people complain that God has abandoned them? Maybe that's how Elijah is feeling. And in this fatigue of his, this fatigue of spirit, he can't imagine that things are going to get better. Have you known that? A time when emotionally or spiritually you've simply felt that there's no hope. Things will not improve. And you can imagine, if you've ever felt that way, why Elijah just wants to sit under a tree. But the message of the angel is the message for Elijah to get up in his fear and in his fatigue, to come to meet God again and to have his faith and his strength restored. Now, notice here that all the angel asks of Elijah is that Elijah gets up and walks, just putting one foot in front of the other. The angel here does not require of Elijah, make sure that you get your prayer life just right, and then God will meet you and encourage you. The angel doesn't say, make sure that on this 40-day journey, you're reading Scripture just right, and then you'll experience the renewal that you long for. The angel doesn't say, this all depends on you, Elijah. Get it right during these 40 days. No. What the angel invites Elijah to is simply one foot in front of the other, just to move toward God. And in this season of Lent, it might feel that you're in a season of your life in which what you're able to do is simply to put one foot in front of the other. And the encouragement of this story to me is that that's enough. Simply to be able to move toward God. So during this season of Lent, if you're feeling that fatigue, or if you're feeling that fear, or if you're even just feeling that frustration, you might imagine to yourself now, how in my relationship with God do I simply put one foot in front of the other throughout this season, to be able to feel that I have my strength and my faith restored? And it might be baby steps. It might simply be reminding ourselves, and in this world of gadgets and gizmos, it's as simple maybe as setting an alarm to say at this time every day, I'm going to make sure that I just spend a few moments in prayer. It may be taking those steps one day after another in picking a book of the Bible, or in picking a chapter of the Bible, just read some every day to step closer to God. Baby steps, one foot in front of the other. If we're feeling like Elijah and feeling like we're lost and alone in the world, maybe the one foot in front of the other is to make sure that we are trying to find some company and companionship along the way. Calling out to someone in the Sunday school class, or to someone in the family every day during this season of Lent to say, hey, will you pray for me today about this thing that I'm dealing with? Or will you pray for me today that tomorrow I can get up and do the next right thing, in the words of grief recovery? It's simply putting one foot in front of the other and trusting that God will meet us there to restore our strength and faith. One thing that I love about John Wesley, the founder of our Methodist movement, is that he was so honest with himself and with others about his struggles in the faith. It didn't seem necessary to him to appear that he had it all together all the time. There's a point in his journal at which he writes about how lucky he felt like he was to encounter a sermon by his friend Peter Bowler. But that particular sermon, which happened to be on Sunday, March 5th, about this time of year, about 300 years ago, John Wesley was convinced as he sat in the pew of what he calls, he was clearly convinced of his own unbelief, of the lack of that faith by which alone we are saved. He was convinced that he was just without faith. It might have been a moment in which, sitting in that pew, he felt like he was sitting under the broom tree. And so immediately, he says, it struck into my mind, leave off preaching. How can you preach to others who have not faith yourself? So he asked his friend Peter Bowler whether he thought that John Wesley should stop preaching or not. And Bowler answered him in this way, by no means should you leave off preaching. So Wesley asked, but what can I preach? And here are the famous words that Peter Bowler spoke to him. He said, preach faith until you have it. And then because you have it, you will preach faith. In our life during this season of Lent, maybe it's not preaching faith. Maybe it's practicing faith. One foot in front of the other. Praying as if we believe. Reading as if we believe. Interacting with others as if we believe. In our fear and in our fatigue, until we find that our strength and our faith is gradually renewed. Because the rest of the story that we didn't read today in the following 8 verses is that after taking one step after the other over 40 days and meeting God there on the mountain, God spoke to Elijah words of encouragement to let him know that everything was going to be okay. That if he would continue to be faithful, his life was not in jeopardy. And a better day was ahead for the people of Israel. Maybe at the end of this season of Lent, in that holy weekend of Good Friday through Easter, if we'll simply take one step in front of the other, drawing closer to God, we'll be able to experience that moment, if not on Holy Weekend at some other point, of God letting us know it's going to be okay. In your fear, in your fatigue, in your frustration, God will restore faith. And the image that comes to my mind is that image from the prophet Isaiah. In our weariness, our strength will be renewed, and we might rise up as if on the wings of eagles. My prayer for us this season is that if we'll simply take one step, one foot in front of the other, that at the end of this season we might rise up and have our faith and strength renewed. Amen.